Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into the story. Mark Davis had never been the kind of man to entertain ideas like the one Eleanor Brooks was offering him that evening. At just 23, he was a final-year law student struggling to balance his part-time job, overwhelming debt from his late father's medical bills, and the pressure of keeping his head above water in an unforgiving world. He wasn't someone who thought about marriage, especially not with someone he barely knew. But here he was, standing in the dimly lit corner of a cozy bistro in Texas, face-to-face with Eleanor, a striking woman in her late 60s, impeccably dressed, and carrying an air of authority that immediately made him uneasy. "I know about your debts, Mark," she began, her voice calm, measured, almost too perfect. Mark's heart skipped. "And I know how much you've been struggling to stay afloat. So, I'm here with an offer. A solution." He blinked, his mind racing as he tried to process what she was saying. "What kind of solution?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. She smiled faintly, her eyes unwavering. "I want you to marry me." The words hung in the air, heavy with an unnerving calmness that took Mark completely by surprise. He shook his head, unsure if he had heard her correctly. "I'm sorry, what?" He laughed softly, more out of confusion than amusement. "I don't need love, Mark," she continued, unfazed by his reaction. "What I need is a companion, someone to share my name, to stand by my side. And in exchange, I will pay off your debts, secure your future. All I ask for is your commitment in the form of a contract marriage." Mark stared at her, trying to read her face. It didn't make sense. This couldn't be real. But Eleanor was unwavering, and somehow, the idea was becoming less absurd the more he thought about it. She wasn't asking for love, she was asking for something else, something practical, something he couldn't afford to ignore. "I don't even know you," Mark muttered, running a hand through his damp hair. "Why me?" Eleanor's expression softened for the first time since they had started speaking. "You're young, unattached, and in need of help. I don't want affection, Mark. I want a business arrangement. A partnership in the most straightforward sense." Mark's mind spun. He thought of his mother's mounting medical bills, his sister's upcoming tuition fees, and the constant pressure of not knowing how long he could keep going before everything fell apart. Was this his way out? Was it worth considering? He took a deep breath and finally asked, "What's in it for you? Why a man like me?" Eleanor leaned in slightly, her voice low and purposeful. "Because I've spent my life alone, Mark. No children. No family left to carry on my name or legacy. This arrangement, this marriage, would ensure that. It's business, nothing more. But it would be the one thing that secures my future and your financial stability." Mark felt a twinge in his chest, the weight of her words sinking in. He had no choice but to acknowledge the logic behind it all. His debts weren't going to disappear, and his options were running out fast. But could he really say yes to such an unorthodox proposal? "You don't have to answer me right away," she added, sensing his hesitation. "But don't take too long. The offer won't be on the table forever." Mark stood there for a moment, lost in thought. It felt like his entire life had led to this crossroads between holding on to his pride or letting go of it for the sake of survival. Eleanor wasn't asking for love, she was offering a lifeline. But at what cost? After a long pause, he finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, "I'll do it. I'll marry you." She smiled, a faint glimmer of approval in her eyes. "Good. The arrangements will be made immediately." As he followed her to the next step in his new life, Mark couldn't help but wonder if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life, or if this could actually be the beginning of something unexpected. Let's see where this strange journey takes him. The rain had not stopped since that night at the bistro. It was as if the sky itself was testing Mark Davis's resolve. 1 week later, he stood inside the small courthouse of Brookdale County, wearing the only suit he owned, a dark navy one that Eleanor's assistant had tailored for him. Everything about that day felt surreal, like he was watching someone else's life unfold. Across from him stood Eleanor Brooks, poised and elegant in a cream-colored suit that looked effortlessly expensive. Her silver hair was pinned neatly, and her expression was calm, unreadable. The ceremony was short, quiet, and officiant. No music, no guests, no vows beyond the legal ones. Only the sound of rain tapping softly against the tall courthouse windows filled the silence. When the officiant finally declared them husband and wife, Eleanor extended her hand with a polite, measured smile. "Welcome to your new life, Mr. Davis," she said. Her words were kind but carried a gravity that Mark could not quite define. He managed a small nod, still unsure whether he should thank her or run. As they stepped outside, a sleek black car waited at the curb, the driver holding the door open. The air smelled of wet asphalt and fading thunder. Mark slid into the back seat beside Eleanor, his mind spinning as the city blurred past the window. The silence between them felt heavier than the storm outside. He had done it. He had married a woman almost 50 years older than him, a woman he barely knew. But debts were gone, his mother's hospital bills were paid, and his sister's tuition secured. That had to count for something, he told himself. The car turned onto a long, private driveway lined with ancient oak trees. At the end stood a mansion so large it seemed carved out of a different era, white columns, stone lions guarding the entrance, and lights glowing softly through tall windows. The Brooks estate. The car came to a smooth stop, and Mark's chest tightened as he stepped out. The marble steps glistened from the rain, and his reflection stared back from the polished front doors. Eleanor turned to him with the same composed grace. "You will find your room upstairs. Dinner is served at 7. Formal attire." Her tone was not unkind, but it left no room for questions. A housekeeper appeared and guided him through a maze of hallways lined with portraits of people who looked just as serious and wealthy as Eleanor. His room was more like a hotel suite: high ceilings, a fireplace, silk curtains, and a bed so large it looked absurd for one person. But despite the luxury, it felt cold, untouched by warmth or life. He sat at the edge of the bed, staring at his reflection in the mirror across the room. The suit fit him perfectly, but he could still see the old version of himself beneath it: struggling student, the tired son, the man who once believed love should mean something more than survival. At 7 sharp, he made his way downstairs. The dining room was long, almost intimidating, with a chandelier that shimmered like ice. Eleanor sat at the far end of the table, sipping tea as if this were just another business dinner. A soft classical tune played from hidden speakers. "Please, sit," she said without looking up. The table between them could have fit 20 guests, yet it felt strangely small in that moment. Mark took his seat, unsure what to say. The meal was impeccable: grilled salmon, roasted vegetables, a bottle of white wine he could not pronounce. Eleanor cut her food with precise, deliberate movements. Finally, she spoke. "You must understand, Mark, appearances are everything in my world. People will talk. They always do. But if we play our parts correctly, both of us will get what we need." Mark nodded slowly. "And what exactly do you need?" She placed her fork down, her gaze steady. "Control. Legacy. The comfort of knowing that when I am gone, my name will not be dragged through the greed of distant relatives who never cared for me." Her honesty startled him. There was something almost tragic in the way she said it. "I am not asking you to love me," she continued. "Just to be present. To keep up the image. In return, you will have financial freedom and the chance to rebuild your life." He hesitated before answering. "And what happens when people start asking questions? When they wonder why a young man like me would marry you?" Her lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "Let them wonder. The truth is rarely as interesting as the story people invent." They finished dinner in silence. When she finally stood, the sound of her heels echoed through the vast room. "Good night, Mr. Davis. Your real work begins tomorrow." She disappeared down the hallway, leaving him alone in the golden light of the chandelier. Mark sat there for a long while, staring at the empty chair across the table. He told himself this was temporary, just a means to an end. Yet deep down, a strange unease had begun to take root, a whisper that maybe, just maybe, this contract was not as simple as he wanted to believe. The days that followed felt like a blur. Mark woke up each morning in the vast bedroom of the Brooks estate, surrounded by luxury he'd never imagined. But despite the silk sheets and marble floors, something inside him was unsettled. Eleanor had kept her distance, as promised. There were no romantic gestures, no forced conversations about their marriage. It was simply a business arrangement. But as the days passed, Mark began to notice small things that started to chip away at the walls he'd built around his emotions. The first came on the third evening when Eleanor asked him to accompany her to a charity gala. "I think it's time to make our public appearance," she had said, her tone cool and professional. Mark had nodded, unable to refuse. As he stood beside her in the grand ballroom, surrounded by the city's elite, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was playing a role he hadn't fully understood. Eleanor was a master at blending into her world, her smile always perfect, her posture impeccable. She moved through the crowd like a queen, nodding politely at everyone, her eyes never revealing more than they had to. Mark, on the other hand, felt like an outsider, unsure of his place among the high-profile guests who seemed to know exactly what to say and do. But then, as they were walking across the room to greet some of her business associates, Eleanor's hand brushed his arm. It was a fleeting moment, almost unnoticeable, but it sent a shiver down his spine. He looked at her, but she didn't look back. The gesture felt oddly intimate, like a small crack in the carefully constructed distance between them. The night continued in much the same way, politely distant, but there was a tension in the air that Mark couldn't ignore. He found himself glancing at Eleanor more than once, noticing the way she interacted with others, always composed, but never vulnerable. When they finally returned to the estate, Eleanor excused herself, saying she was tired. Mark stood in the hallway, watching her disappear behind the grand doors of her private study. That was when he heard the soft sound of her voice, talking to someone on the phone. It was brief, but it caught his attention. "Yes, everything is going according to plan," she said. "Mark is playing his part perfectly." Mark froze, unsure of what to make of it. He had heard his name, but the rest of the conversation had been too quiet to understand. It was a strange feeling, the realization that Eleanor was still keeping things from him. He wasn't just a husband on paper, he was part of a larger plan, a plan he hadn't fully understood. That night, as he lay in bed, the weight of the situation began to sink in. He wasn't just married to Eleanor Brooks, she was a pawn in a game he hadn't been briefed on. The next morning, Eleanor was more distant than usual. She barely acknowledged him during breakfast, her mind clearly preoccupied with something else. But when Mark tried to ask about the phone call from the previous night, she simply smiled and changed the subject. "I need you to attend a meeting with me this afternoon," she said, her tone all business. "It's important that we start acting as a team, publicly." Mark nodded, his mind still reeling. As they drove to the meeting, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being drawn deeper into something he didn't fully understand. The closer they got to their destination, the more his stomach twisted. He had agreed to this arrangement for practical reasons, to pay off his debts, to help his family, but now, he wasn't so sure anymore. Was he still just playing the part of a husband in a contract, or was there something more to this strange, complicated relationship? When they arrived at the meeting, Mark was once again thrust into the role of the perfect husband, standing by Eleanor's side as she handled the business discussions with ease. He said little, nodding when necessary, trying not to attract too much attention. But as the meeting wore on, he found himself watching Eleanor closely, noticing the way she moved, the way she spoke. There was something about her that was beginning to pull at him, something he couldn't quite place. And with every passing day, as the walls between them slowly began to erode, Mark started to wonder if he had made a mistake, or if maybe, just maybe, this strange arrangement could lead to something more. The following week, things between Mark and Eleanor continued to unfold with a strange sort of quiet. Mark had spent more time at the Brooks estate, attending meetings with Eleanor and accompanying her to events. He had gotten used to the luxurious surroundings, the sprawling estate, the lavish dinners, the distant but polite interactions with Eleanor. But despite the outward perfection, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. They spoke to each other daily, but their conversations were always businesslike, always surface level. They had yet to share anything personal, anything beyond their contract. Still, there were small moments that made him wonder if there could be more to their arrangement. It happened again one evening, during dinner. They were seated at the long table, the soft hum of classical music in the background, when Eleanor placed her wine glass down and looked at him, her gaze unusually soft. "You've done well, Mark," she said, her voice calm but sincere. "I'm impressed with how you've adapted to all of this." Mark looked up, surprised. Eleanor rarely offered compliments, especially not about their arrangement. "I've been trying my best," he replied, his voice unsure. "I still don't know if I'm doing it right." Eleanor smiled faintly, almost knowingly. "There's no right or wrong," she said. "You're here. That's all that matters." Her words lingered in the air between them. For the first time in a long while, Mark found himself wondering if maybe Eleanor wasn't as cold as he had once thought. Maybe there was more to her than the businesswoman who kept everything tightly under control. But before he could say anything, she stood up abruptly. "We have an event to attend," she said, her tone returning to its usual efficiency. Mark nodded, not wanting to press the issue further. As they made their way to the car, he couldn't help but replay the brief exchange in his mind. What had she meant by that? Was she genuinely starting to see him as something more than just a contractual partner? Or was it just another polite gesture, nothing more? The event that night was another high society affair, a gala hosted by one of Eleanor's closest business partners. The guests were the usual mix of celebrities, politicians, and wealthy entrepreneurs, all mingling with champagne in hand, exchanging pleasantries and deals. Eleanor was, as always, the picture of grace, moving effortlessly through the crowd, her every step deliberate and composed. Mark, on the other hand, once again felt out of place. He was still learning the unspoken rules of this world, how to smile just right, how to make small talk without sounding awkward. As they stood near the bar, a man approached them, offering a drink to Eleanor. Mark instinctively stepped back, giving them space, but Eleanor's hand on his arm stopped him. She didn't speak, but the touch made him pause. For a moment, the rest of the world seemed to fade away, and all he could focus on was her touch, the warmth that lingered in his skin long after she had let go. It was brief, but it was enough to make his heart race. Eleanor continued her conversation with the man, but Mark found himself distracted, the moment playing over and over in his mind. Was this a sign of something changing? Or was it just another fleeting gesture? He didn't know, but one thing was certain: couldn't stop thinking about her. As the evening wore on, Eleanor excused herself, saying she had business to attend to. Mark stayed behind, mingling with a few of the other guests, but his mind kept drifting back to her. The way her presence commanded the room, the way her smile could light up the darkest corners of the venue, it all felt so distant, yet so captivating. When the event finally ended, Mark found himself in the back seat of the car, the silence between him and Eleanor thicker than ever. He had no idea what had just happened between them, but the question hung in the air: was he still just a pawn in her game, or was there something more to their connection? As they pulled up to the estate, Eleanor broke the silence. "You've done well tonight," she said, her voice quiet. Mark nodded, unsure of how to respond. "Thank you," he muttered, not quite meeting her gaze. He wanted to say more, to ask her what she meant, but the words wouldn't come. Eleanor didn't press him further, and they entered the house in silence. That night, as Mark lay in bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting between them. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there. And for the first time, he couldn't help but wonder if their marriage, this business arrangement, was starting to become something more. The days following the gala were a blur, but something had shifted between Mark and Eleanor. Mark couldn't quite place it, but every time their paths crossed, there was an unspoken tension. A look. A gesture. Small things, but they left him questioning the true nature of their arrangement. Eleanor had continued to be professional, as always, her demeanor unwavering, her control over the situation absolute. But there were moments when her eyes lingered a little too long, or when her touch lasted a fraction longer than necessary. He couldn't deny it anymore, he was beginning to feel something for her. But was it real? Or was it just a result of the strange circumstances they found themselves in? Eleanor didn't offer any answers. She remained as distant as ever, always courteous, always measured. And yet, whenever they were together, there was a certain comfort that began to settle between them, despite the stark difference in their worlds. Mark continued to fulfill his role, attending meetings with her, sitting in on conferences, making the occasional appearance at business events. In public, they played the part of a married couple, perfectly in sync. But behind closed doors, it was a different story. It was on the fourth weekend after the gala when Mark first truly questioned the nature of his feelings. He had been in the library, flipping through a book on business law, when Eleanor appeared at the door. Her usual calm was replaced by a soft vulnerability Mark hadn't seen before. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice quieter than usual. Mark put the book down, his heart skipping. He had never seen Eleanor like this. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her. "About what?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. She walked over to the window, looking out over the estate's grounds. "I've been thinking," she began, her back to him. "This marriage. It was supposed to be simple. A contract. No feelings. No complications." She paused, and Mark could hear the faint hesitation in her voice. "But I'm not sure anymore." His heart raced. He stood up from the chair, walking toward her slowly. "What do you mean?" She turned around to face him, her expression conflicted. "I never expected this to be hard," she admitted. "I thought I could keep it all separate, business, personal, emotions, but the longer we've been living like this, the more I've realized that it's not that easy. I'm not just playing my part anymore. I'm starting to care. I didn't plan for this." Mark didn't know what to say. He had been feeling the same way, torn between the life he'd always known and the unexpected feelings that had begun to take root. Eleanor had always been so controlled, so deliberate with everything she did. But here, in front of him, she seemed uncertain. Human, even. "I didn't sign up for this either," Mark said, his voice steady. "But I guess neither of us did. I'm not sure how we got here, but we're here now." Eleanor's gaze softened, and for a moment, they just stood there, the distance between them almost imperceptible. Then, in a quiet voice, Eleanor added, "I know this is complicated. I don't know where this is going. But I can't keep pretending like I don't feel something." Mark took a step closer, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to reach out, to say something, but the words wouldn't come. The silence between them stretched on, thick with unspoken emotions. Finally, Eleanor broke the silence. "I think we need to figure out what this means," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark nodded slowly, his mind racing. He had never expected things to get this complicated, but now, standing here with Eleanor, he realized that their arrangement was no longer just about money or survival. It was about something deeper, something he wasn't sure he was ready to confront. But it was there, undeniable. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think we do." They stood there for a long moment, the weight of the situation hanging heavy in the air. Neither of them moved, both lost in their thoughts. But deep down, Mark knew one thing for certain: whatever this was, it was no longer just a business deal. Something had changed. And he wasn't sure where it would lead, but he knew he couldn't walk away now. Not when he was starting to care too. The next few days were filled with an unspoken tension that neither Mark nor Eleanor knew how to address. They had spoken briefly about their feelings, but neither had taken the next step. The walls they had built around themselves remained, but now they felt fragile, like they could collapse at any moment. Mark spent most of his time working on business documents with Eleanor, attending meetings, and adjusting to his new life in the high society world Eleanor had pulled him into. Yet, whenever he glanced at her, he felt a sense of confusion. Was this just part of their arrangement, or was there something deeper at play? Eleanor, too, seemed conflicted. Her usual cold composure faltered on occasion, and she would glance at him with an expression that seemed both distant and longing. It was in the quiet moments when they were alone in the estate that Mark felt the most uncertainty. One evening, as they sat on the terrace overlooking the estate's gardens, Eleanor finally broke the silence. "Mark," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I know this isn't what we expected. I'm not asking you to love me, but I need to know if this thing between us is real. Or if it's just part of the contract." Mark turned toward her, his heart racing. Her gaze was steady, but there was a vulnerability in her eyes that made him want to reach out. "I don't know what this is, Eleanor," he admitted, his voice raw. "But I can't keep pretending that this is just business. I care about you. I've started to care, and I'm not sure what to do with that." Eleanor's lips parted as though she was about to say something, but then she hesitated. The words didn't come, and for a moment, the distance between them felt almost unbearable. Mark looked at her, searching for some sign of what she was feeling. But Eleanor's usual strength, her unshakable control, had softened. He could see it in the way she held herself, the way her hands clenched slightly as if she was fighting against something. She let out a long breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted to fall for you, Mark. But I can't deny it anymore. I think I'm starting to." Mark's heart skipped a beat. He had heard the words, but they still didn't fully sink in. Eleanor, the woman who had built an empire and lived her life by her own rules, was admitting that she had feelings for him. It was overwhelming, both in its beauty and its complexity. "What does this mean?" he asked softly, his voice trembling slightly. "What do we do now?" Eleanor stood up, her back to him as she stared out at the darkening horizon. "I don't know," she said after a pause. "I don't have all the answers. I thought this was just a deal, a way to fix things. But now I'm not so sure." Mark stood up and walked over to her, standing just a few feet behind her. "You don't have to figure everything out right now," he said, his voice soothing. "I'm here. We'll figure this out together." Eleanor turned to face him, her expression softening. "I'm scared, Mark," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "Scared of what this could mean for us, for everything. I've spent my whole life in control, and now I don't know what to do with what I'm feeling." Mark reached out, taking her hand gently in his. "It's okay to be scared," he said, his thumb lightly brushing her knuckles. "We don't have to have it all figured out. But we can take this one step at a time." They stood there for a long moment, the weight of the unspoken words hanging between them. For the first time in a long time, neither of them felt the need to have all the answers. They didn't need to rush, didn't need to force anything. They had both been through enough. Mark, with his struggles, and Eleanor, with her lifetime of control and independence. Now, for the first time, they were both letting go. Eleanor's grip on his hand tightened slightly, and Mark could feel the warmth of her touch. It was a simple gesture, but it carried with it a promise. A promise that they would figure this out together, no matter what came next. And in that moment, Mark knew one thing for sure: no matter how complicated things had gotten, he couldn't imagine his life without her. They weren't just two people in a business deal anymore. They were something more. And for the first time, he was ready to embrace it. The next morning, Mark woke up feeling a strange sense of calm. It had been a restless night, filled with thoughts and questions he wasn't sure how to answer, but now, there was a certain clarity. Eleanor had opened up to him in a way she hadn't before. They were no longer just two people bound by a contract. Something had changed between them, and it was both exciting and terrifying. Mark was still unsure what their future would look like, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid to explore it. When he came downstairs for breakfast, Eleanor was already there, sitting at the long dining table, reviewing some documents. Her usual composure was back, but Mark noticed the subtle shift in her demeanor. She didn't look at him like she had before, like he was just a part of the deal. There was something else there now, a softness in her gaze. She looked up as he entered the room, and for a moment, their eyes locked. "Good morning," she said, her voice as calm as always, but there was a slight tremor in it. "Good morning," Mark replied, his voice steady. He hesitated for a moment before sitting down at the table. The tension from the night before still hung in the air, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt hopeful. "I've been thinking," Eleanor began, breaking the silence. "About us." Mark's heart skipped. He wasn't sure what she was going to say, but he braced himself. "I know we've been trying to keep things professional," she continued, her eyes never leaving his. "But I can't ignore what's happening between us anymore. I feel it, Mark. And I think you do too." Mark nodded slowly, his throat tightening. "I do," he said quietly. "But I'm not sure where this is going, Eleanor. I don't know what this means for us." Eleanor exhaled deeply, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "I don't know either. But I don't want to pretend anymore. We've both been living in a kind of controlled distance. But I can't keep that up." Mark felt a weight lift off his shoulders. It was as if a wall that had been between them was finally crumbling, piece by piece. "Then let's stop pretending," Mark said, his voice more confident now. "We don't have to have it all figured out, but I don't want to keep going through the motions. I want to see where this can go." Eleanor smiled softly, and for the first time, Mark saw a real sense of relief in her expression. "You're right," she said. "We've spent so much time thinking about the what-ifs and the shoulds. Maybe it's time to just let things unfold." As they talked, the conversation turned from their complicated arrangement to the simple things, the things they enjoyed, their hopes, and the things they were afraid of. For the first time, Mark felt like he was getting to know the real Eleanor. And in turn, he felt like she was getting to know him, not as the man she had hired for a business deal, but as someone who could be a partner, in every sense of the word. They didn't need answers right away. They didn't need to know exactly where this path would lead, but for the first time, they were both willing to walk it together. And that was enough. Later that afternoon, Eleanor had to attend a meeting with some investors. Mark didn't have anything planned, so he decided to take a walk through the estate. He found himself reflecting on how much had changed in such a short time. Only weeks ago, he had been unsure of his place in this world, unsure of his future, and now, it seemed like the possibilities were endless. The weight of his past, the debts, the struggle hadn't disappeared, but for the first time, he didn't feel so alone in carrying it. When Eleanor returned that evening, she seemed lighter, somehow. She walked into the living room, where Mark was waiting. "I've been thinking," she said with a small smile. "We need to take a trip. A break from all this business. Just the two of us, no distractions." Mark's heart lifted at the suggestion. For the first time in weeks, they were talking about something personal, something beyond the contract they had signed. "That sounds perfect," Mark said, standing up to join her. "Where are we going?" Eleanor grinned. "Somewhere peaceful. Somewhere where we can just be ourselves." Mark smiled back, feeling something he hadn't expected: hope. They didn't know where this would lead. But for the first time, it didn't matter. They were in this together. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of anticipation as Eleanor and Mark prepared for their getaway. It was a strange feeling leaving behind the estate, the world of business meetings, and high society events for something simpler, more personal. For the first time in a long while, Mark felt a sense of freedom. They had chosen a small, secluded cabin in the mountains, far away from the world they had known. A place where they could be themselves without the pressure of appearances, without the weight of expectations. As they arrived at the cabin, nestled between tall pines and surrounded by snow-capped mountains, it felt like the world had fallen silent. It was the kind of quiet Mark had never experienced before. No city noise, no deadlines, just the soft rustling of the trees and the crunch of snow beneath their boots. They spent the first few days in a comfortable silence, exploring the area, cooking meals together, and simply enjoying each other's company. It was as if they had both shed the roles they had been playing for so long, the businessman and the wife, the contract partners, and had become something new. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, sharing stories about their pasts. Mark talked about his childhood, about growing up in a small town, about his father and the sacrifices he had made. Eleanor shared her own story, about the challenges she had faced in building her empire, about the loneliness that often came with power, and the walls she had built to protect herself. For the first time, they were not just sharing space, they were sharing pieces of themselves. It was a side of Eleanor Mark had never seen before, and it made him realize how much he still had to learn about her. But it also made him realize that this wasn't just about business anymore. It was about trust, about understanding each other's vulnerabilities, and about finding a way to move forward together. On the fourth evening, as they sat outside under a blanket of stars, Eleanor turned to him. "Mark," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of everything they had been through. "I know this started as something practical. But I can't pretend it's just that anymore." Mark looked at her, his heart beating faster. "I know," he replied quietly. "I've felt the same way." Eleanor took a deep breath, her gaze drifting toward the dark silhouette of the mountains in the distance. "I don't know what's going to happen next. I don't know what the future holds for us. But I do know this thing between us, whatever it is, it's real. And I don't want to lose it." Mark reached out, taking her hand in his. It was the first time they had touched like this, in a way that wasn't out of obligation, in a way that felt genuine. "You won't lose me," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "We'll figure this out together, one step at a time." The words hung in the air, soft but powerful. For the first time, Eleanor's guarded expression softened, and a smile tugged at the corner of her lips. It wasn't the polished smile she often wore in public. It was real, vulnerable, and full of emotion. It was a smile Mark had never seen before, but he realized it was the one he had been waiting for. As the night wore on, they sat there, side by side, watching the stars, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The future was uncertain, but in that moment, Mark realized that they didn't need all the answers. They just needed to trust each other, and that was enough. The following weeks flew by in a blur of quiet moments and deep conversations. Mark and Eleanor had settled into a rhythm that felt more like a partnership than anything they had experienced before. They spent their days hiking in the mountains, reading together by the fire, and even cooking meals for each other. The pressure of the outside world seemed to fade, leaving only the two of them, learning about each other in ways they hadn't before. Eleanor had opened up to him in ways she never had in their previous life. Mark learned about the pain of her past, the sacrifices she had made to build her empire, the loneliness she had faced as a woman in a world dominated by men, and the walls she had put up to protect herself. Mark, in turn, shared his own story, the struggles of growing up in a small town, the sacrifices his parents had made, and how the weight of their financial burdens had shaped him into the man he was today. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time, Mark felt like he truly understood Eleanor. He wasn't just a man caught in her business arrangement anymore. He was someone she trusted. And that meant everything. On the last day of their trip, as they sat on the porch of the cabin, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Eleanor turned to Mark. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice calm but filled with meaning. "We've come a long way since we first started this arrangement." Mark looked at her, his heart full of emotions he wasn't sure how to express. "I never imagined it would end up like this," he said, his voice soft. Eleanor smiled, her eyes softening as she looked at him. "Neither did I. But here we are." There was a moment of silence between them, a peaceful kind of silence that felt comfortable, like a promise without words. Finally, Eleanor spoke again. "Mark, I don't know what the future holds for us. I don't know where this is going, but I know one thing for sure: I don't want to let go of what we have." Mark felt his heart race, the weight of her words sinking in. He had thought about this moment a lot, about what would happen when they returned to their old lives, to the world that had seemed so distant and unfamiliar just weeks ago. But now, with Eleanor by his side, he wasn't afraid anymore. "I don't want to let go either," he said, his voice steady. Eleanor leaned in, her forehead gently resting against his. "Then we'll figure it out together," she whispered. And just like that, Mark knew that they would. When they returned to the estate, things were different. It wasn't the grand mansion or the expensive meetings that mattered Anna Marie, it was their connection, their trust, and the understanding they had built between them. They were no longer just business partners, no longer just two people bound by a contract. They were a team. The challenges they had faced, both separately and together, had only made them stronger. Mark and Eleanor didn't have all the answers, but they didn't need them. They had each other, and that was enough. In the end, it wasn't about the riches or the status or the deal they had made. It was about finding something real, something worth holding on to. And for the first time in his life, Mark knew that love wasn't just a fantasy, it was something they had built together. With that knowledge, he turned to Eleanor, his partner, his love, and he asked, "What now?" Eleanor smiled, her eyes filled with hope. "Now, we live," she said softly. And together, they stepped into the future, hand in hand, ready for whatever came next.